Hello, China. This is Bruce Perens, and I'm really happy to be able to speak with you. I have to apologize. I planned to be there in person. Everything that could go wrong did, and I'm very sorry that it didn't work out. I hope to see you in China at another event. So, who is Bruce Perens? Well, I'm credited on feature films from Pixar Animation Studios. The films are A Bug's Life and Toy Story 2, although software that I wrote was used in several other of Pixar's films and films of other companies. Disney actually used some of my software to restore the old animated film Snow White. I believe some of it was used to help Arnold Schwarzenegger appear to fly in the Terminator films, etc. So besides working on film, I made the first announcement of open source to the world. I created the open source definition, the rules for licensing of open source, which still stand today. I created the field of embedded Linux when I created the BusyBox software. That was a very small program that, along with the Linux kernel, made a complete embedded system. And I created the modern Linux distribution as second Debian project leader, and I'll explain why people tell me I did this. It's because when I got on the Debian project, the entire system that you needed to boot Debian, we called it the core system, was developed by one developer, Ian Murdoch, who was the original Debian project leader. And I took that system and distributed it to many of the Debian developers. At that time, there were about 60 of us. I built the project up to about 200. And that was something that no one had ever tried before. No one had ever given an operating system core to many developers who never saw each other. They didn't work for the same company. We had only met on the internet. We didn't even have video back then. We didn't even have audio conferencing. We only corresponded by email, and occasionally one of us would make a phone call to another. So when a team that was that loosely coupled was able to make a system that did, in fact, boot and run very stably, that was the first time that happened. I successfully lobbied the United Nations, actually an organization of it called the International Telecommunications Union, to stop requiring a Morse code test for radio sport. We call that ham radio. I think you call it radio sport in China. My call sign on the radio is Kilo 6 Bravo Papa. That's K6BP. And after I did that lobbying, most countries in the world dropped the test on Morse code, but I'm not sure about China. Someone should tell me. And I'm still driving open source development today, mostly for wireless communications like radio sport. So how did open source happen? From the earliest days of software, software was freely shared among people, along with the source code. And this was very easy to do because the software would only work on one kind of computer, and the manufacturer made their money by selling the hardware rather than the software. But as time went on, companies that only made software arose. And Microsoft was one of them. And they made the DOS operating system, They needed to be paid directly for their software. So there's a very famous letter from Bill Gates to computer hobbyists telling them that they had to pay for DOS. They couldn't just copy it. And of course, Bill became insanely wealthy. And I doubt that the hobbyists made a difference. Copyright has a long history. It first existed in China during the Song Dynasty. And in the Europe, I think Ireland was first, and about the 6th century AD, the People's Republic of China enacted a Western-style copyright law in the 1990s. Why would China enact Western-style copyright? Well, European nations and the United States have persuaded other countries to adopt copyright law very similar to theirs. They made that a requirement of their trade treaties. And China eventually joined those treaties to have less foreign tax. It's called a tariff on China's exports of manufactured goods. But there was a rebellion against copyright. Programmers weren't at all happy when companies stopped sharing software and source code. And one programmer, Richard Stallman, got so angry that he dedicated his entire life to sharing software. Richard created the free software movement, with free meaning freedom rather than zero cost. He wrote many tools that we could share, a C compiler, an editor, etc. Other people started sharing their own code along with Richard. Eventually, we had everything but a good operating system kernel. Linus Torvalds used Richard's C compiler and other tools to write the Linux kernel. Now we could do all of our work with software that we could share. At this time, I was working at Pixar, the feature film studio. The owner of Pixar was Steve Jobs. Steve had been the founder of Apple Computer, but he'd been fired from his job at Apple. And back then, he thought that eventually we would move our software to Microsoft Windows. At that time, my office was right across the hall from Steve's. Not because I was important, maybe because they wanted to keep an eye on me. But I could walk into Steve's office and talk with him anytime. Imagine that. Microsoft Windows was really bad back then. It's improved quite a lot because it has competition now. Many of us started contributing our work to the development of Linux so that we would have a better system than Windows to use at work. We just weren't interested in developing on Windows. Of course, Steve eventually became Apple's CEO again. And he was back to wanting software on the Macintosh. I started to work on the Debian Linux distribution. One of the problems of Debian was that we wanted it to be only free software. But what software was that? I wrote a guideline for Debian about what was free software. That, a few months later, became the open source definition, the rules for open source. And we started to create a way of talking about free software to business, and we called that open source. That's how it came about. The open source idea really caught on. Today, it dominates the field of software. So what's important about open source? Well, not just source code. The most important thing about open source is the rights that it gives you: the right to use, distribute, and modify the program. The default in copyright law is all rights reserved, and that means you can't do anything with it unless someone gives you a license. If it's illegal to do anything with it, the source code is useless. So rights are the most important thing about open source. What did we learn in the early days of open source from this tremendous adoption we were getting? Well, one thing was that every company was using copyright incorrectly. Every company. Their lawyers told them it was very important to protect their copyrights, so they didn't share anything. And they missed all of the opportunities that could come from sharing. So how did the economics of open source work? Well, they're difficult to figure out, but they're really very simple. Consider that in a business you have some software that makes your company look better than its competitors. That software is called a business differentiator. But most of your software is the kind that you need. You can't do your job without it. But it doesn't make you look any different from your competitor. That's called non-differentiating software. So you should share the development of non-differentiating software with other companies as open source. You should even share it with your worst competitor. Why? Why? Because sharing makes your company a better competitor. Now that you're sharing the development of non-differentiating software, the cost and risk of developing that software is shared by many companies. So you save money on its development and get better software. Now take that money and spend it on developing business differentiating software that makes your company look better than its competitor. Everyone should share the development of infrastructure software. We get better infrastructure that way, and we each pay less than if we were developing it alone. Today, we can probably say that most software in the world is open source. Estimates are that most applications are based on open source, sometimes in excess of 80% of code in the application. More code than the company's own developers wrote. So, we won. Or did we? Did we win? Open source has also failed in a number of critical ways. Perhaps the most important is that open source does not serve the software needs of most people. The normal person, the so-called man on the street, the person who isn't a computer expert, doesn't really use open source. They don't even know what it is. If they use our software, it's as an infrastructure component of software from Apple, Google, or Microsoft systems that mostly serve proprietary applications. It doesn't appear that Harmony OS from China will be any different. It contains lots of open source, I've seen the list, and it serves proprietary applications. And of course, we know that proprietary operating systems and applications spy on their users and work in the company's interest rather than in the interest of the user. We also have what's called the developer conundrum. It's often the case today that the world's largest companies depend on the software of an unpaid open source developer. The XZ software backdoor was one such problem. A developer couldn't spend time supporting rich companies for zero pay, and so he passed the project on to another developer. But that developer turned out to be a criminal. That developer inserted a backdoor in the XZ software that would have compromised most websites and most remote logins, because XZ is used in OpenSSL, and OpenSSL is what makes the HTTPS web protocol and your remote shells. Luckily, someone noticed, but that was more luck than anything else. Compliance is a problem for companies. There are too many open source licenses. Well, this is my fault. When we started, we viewed every new license from a company as a great sign of that company's confidence in open source. So we encourage companies to make new open source licenses. We set up the open source initiative mainly to approve those licenses. We didn't put in their constitution that they should stop. So now there are over 100 open source licenses. Big companies each spend many millions of dollars every year on open source compliance. It's not just because of the number of licenses, it's because they have to check every piece of software for having the right license, for being compatible with the license on every other piece of software in an application. And they have to do that for every dependency and the dependencies of the dependencies. So that's a lot of work. I'd like to make it easier, and I think I know how. Non-compliance is also a big problem. Many companies don't comply with open source licenses and do not distribute source code as required. The open source developers will find the copyright infringement in your code, even if they only see the binary. This has resulted in big legal problems for Chinese companies. In China, many programmers use open source software as a reference when they write their own software. And this is China's problem mainly. This happens, it seems, a lot more here in China. They end up with so much copied from the open source that their work is copyright infringing. And I have unfortunately been hired to help big Chinese companies with this problem. It's a real problem. Just changing the code isn't enough to make it non-infringing. That only makes it something called non-literal copying. So please don't use open source as a reference at all when you're programming at work, unless you're actually working on that open source code. It's too easy to fall into the trap of copying the open source into your commercial work. So how can we fix all of the problems that open source has today? Well, open source is 27 years old, and free software is 41 years old. We've learned very much, and the world has changed tremendously. Following the rules of open source that I created 27 years ago isn't the best way to move into the future. But we should allow open source to go on just as it is today, and we should call the new rules something else. So far, I call them post-open, and you can see the work in progress at postopen.org. So how is PostOpen different? PostOpen provides both freedom and zero cost to the people we really should be helping, individuals and small companies. Large companies with a revenue of over $5 million a year would pay a small portion of that revenue. Compliance to those companies is a check and accounting for what software they use once a year. That would go to our accountant, who is under NDA, and we'd only see the totals. So what the company was using, how much its income was, those things would all stay secret. Collected funds would be apportioned. What that means is that what you make as a programmer would depend on the size of your code contribution and the number of companies using it. We would get that information from an audit by the company and by instrumenting GitHub repositories or Git repositories. They don't have to be on GitHub. And dependencies would definitely count, because we have to pay people like the XZ developer who people didn't even know they were using his software. It was a dependency of OpenSSH and OpenSSL. So can PostOpen really happen? Well, it's going to be important for open source developers because you can dual license both open source and PostOpen. And when you do so, anyone who is paying for PostOpen software, in other words, they're paying for software that's only under PostOpen license, will also start paying for your software. That's part of the rules. So it provides a way for open source developers to start being paid fairly. Obviously, PostOpen is a very ambitious effort, and it may fail. But we succeeded with open source, and that was every bit as crazy as what I'm trying to do now. I'd regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't try to make PostOpen work. Please take a look at postopen.org and send me your opinions. Please feel free to write. I answer my email, and my email address is like my name. It's bruce@perens.com. Thanks very much, and I hope to see you in China soon.